This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next hour or so, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. But let's start with a quick run through the markets here for you. So the Kenyan market is our focus as we wrap up the week. It slammed into yet another fresh multi-year low on Friday. In fact, at 2633.32 points, you've got to go all the way back to around 2009 to find worse performance. And unlike then, Kenya is not recovering from either a political or economic crisis at this point. First quarter GDP data also landed today, annual growth of about 5.6%, drawn back essentially by a drought. We'll have a deep dive on those numbers a little later on in the week. In the meantime, here's what's coming up next. President Xi calls for a fair and non-discriminatory market as a G20 summit opens up. Digital lenders in Kenya form a body designed to self-regulate. And inflation rebounds in the EU, but it offers very little calm to the central bank over there. Our starting point tonight is not in Africa, but it's in Japan, Osaka to be specific, where this year's G20 summit is underway. The Chinese head of state Xi Jinping is calling for an international effort to build what he described as a fair, just and non-discriminatory market environment on the first day of the gathering over there. CGTN's Zhang Yibing has more.
At a meeting held against the complex and increasingly severe geopolitical backdrop, Chinese President Xi Jinping is calling for G20 members to work together.
We should build a fair, just, and non-discriminatory market environment, promoting the flow of technology, personnel, and information. We should maintain the integrity and vitality of the global industrial chain to promote complementary advantages and win-win cooperation. Countries should not close their doors when seeking development, and neither should they artificially interfere in the market.
He's calling on global economies to push forward reform and innovation, improve global governance, address development issues, and resolve disputes in a spirit of partnership. It was also in line with his comments in an informal meeting with BRICS countries earlier in the day. There, he criticized the aggression in the international community, but held back from pointing fingers or naming names.
One of the most prominent risks is that some of the developed countries have frequently taken protectionist and unilateral measures, intentionally provoking trade frictions and technological blockades, undermining the international trade order and the global industrial chain. These moves harm the common interests of all nations. They also cast a shadow on the peaceful and sustainable development of the world.
His comment was echoed by world leaders, including the G20 summit host. On Friday, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe called for a strong G20 message on free, fair, and indiscriminate trade, as he'd expressed deep concerns over the current global trade landscape.
Reciprocal trade restriction measures don't benefit any country. Any trade steps should be in line with WTO rules. I am deeply concerned about the current situation surrounding global trade.
She also met with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and leaders from Africa and elsewhere. For the joint efforts with other countries, the Chinese president also said China will take measures to further open up markets, expand import and improve business environment, ensure fair treatment for foreign enterprises, and press ahead with multilateral trade agreements and negotiations. Zheng Yibing, CGTN, Osaka, in Japan.
Now, as the leaders of the G20 countries meet, Osaka has been pretty busy with sideline meetings focusing on growing global trade tensions. Now, a number of countries are opting for retaliatory measures against American trade protectionism, and that includes the world's largest democracy, India. One of the hardest hit American industries this time is almonds.
Almonds that grow in California's lush valley have been popular in the busy streets on the other side of the earth. in India. Now the future of that market is uncertain. India this month imposed tariffs on 28 American products, including almonds. That's in retaliation for U.S. trade protection measures.
Whenever any country, including USA, is going to hit us with any kind of unilateral tariff hike or some kind of a barrier, trade barrier, putting in the entire process, then obviously India does not have any other option other than retaliating.
California supplies more than 80% of the world's almonds. The industry is estimated to generate more than 100,000 jobs in the U.S. coastal state. Those tariffs raised by India on top of what China placed last year would impact thousands of growers in California.
Around 30% of our almonds stay here for the U.S., but then after that they're shipped around the world, and India is actually our #1 export market right now. So when you think of these tariffs, that's hitting us in an important place.
The effect of the tariffs might ripple outward. Growers might cut down on spending on equipment and fertilizer, or making the choice to replace a tractor. But concerns are for the long term, because for the immediate moment, a lot of contracts have already been signed. In just over a month, the fruit will be harvested from farms, and the nuts will be separated from the shells. Li Chun, CGTN.
The South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is also in Osaka for the G20 summit. Last year, he received praise and support at the G20 meeting in Argentina, just months after he took over the South African presidency from Jacob Zuma. South Africa is the only African member of the G20. Here's CGTN's Sumitra Naidu taking a look at how important this summit is, not just for South Africa, but for the rest of the continent too.
President Ramaphosa wooed world leaders at the last G20 meeting in Argentina with the promise of a new dawn. But the sun is setting and there's been little change. The president has more to push at this year's summit, not only for his own country, but for the rest of the continent too.
South Africa on its own is about 0.5%, half of 1% of global GDP. So we're a pretty small player by global standards. On the other hand, there aren't a lot of other significant players in the continent. There are Nigeria and Egypt, who both have approximately similar-sized economies to South Africa's.
African goals may be overshadowed at this year's summit because of the US-China trade spat. Increasing tensions between the US and the Gulf region may also be in focus. South Africa's paltry position doesn't help.
I think South Africa's earlier years' participation in the G20 was much stronger than what it is today. And the reason for that is because South Africa certainly was the darling of the world in the 1990s and the early 2000s. South Africa certainly is the most sophisticated economy on the African continent. We're not the biggest anymore, and we've been slipping. We've been falling behind some other economies in Africa. And that's a part of the reason why South Africa's status in the world has also diminished in recent years. Because in the end it is about the economy.
But the African agenda is not being sidelined. The G20 Compact with Africa was launched in 2017 during the German presidency to track and report on G20 commitments. Several projects are either in implementation phase or complete in the areas of finance, infrastructure, governance and environment. Africa's sustainable development goals are also being addressed.
Well, to an extent, yes. In any benefit which benefits themselves is going to benefit those countries trading with them. Global trade is a factor nowadays. We can't do without it and we can't hide from it, and I think that is recognized. There is a move of expectations that the emerging market sector is where the growth is going to be centered in the foreseeable future.
Ramaphosa is being accompanied by South African big business with the hope of garnering more support for his massive $100 million investment drive. More importantly, he's hoping to use his seat to speak out on the negative impacts already being felt from the US-China trade dispute. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Onto the commodity side of things, Royal Dutch Shell and ExxonMobil are trying to get back into a market they left more than 2 decades ago, Somalia. And this re-entry proposition is coming ahead of an auction of essentially exploration in about 15 or so oil blocks that will take place later this year. Now, Shell and ExxonMobil had a joint venture in Somalia prior to the toppling of the government of Mohamed Siad Barre in the early 1990s. The parties have also agreed to a plan to convert their old contracts with the authorities then in line with the new petroleum bill that was approved by Somalia's parliament earlier this year. Somalia hopes to auction off 15 offshore blocks for exploration, with a potential bid date scheduled for November. Now, the country doesn't produce any oil or gas at the moment, but production could transform the economy, as early-stage seismic data is pretty promising. It does show there could be significant hydrocarbon reserves offshore. So then let's dig deeper into this story. Abdulaziz Bello runs coverage for us in Somalia. He joins us now live from Mogadishu. So Royal Dutch Shell, Exxon, both active in exploration in the country before the fall of the Siad Barre regime and the civil war that followed. Walk us through the history they had of their work in Somalia.
Well, Ramah, just as you have mentioned, Shell and ExxonMobil, they are the two fast Western oil corporations to show interest in the Somali hydrocarbon industry. And according to the Minister of Petroleum, the hydrocarbon sector in Somalia started almost in 1954, just 6 years before Somalia attained independence. But it did not catch up immediately. But in 1984, the former central Somali government under Siad Barre put more emphasis on the hydrocarbon sector and attracted large corporations, mostly Western. And Shell and Exxon were the first to show interest in the Somali hydrocarbon sector, and they managed to secure very handsome packages from the government. Then they secured good contracts for oil drilling onshore and offshore. But that was short-lived, because 6 years later, Somalia plunged into anarchy, and that's 2 decades, that's almost 3 decades later, those two corporations, big Western oil corporations, are showing interest in Somalia. So the fact that they were here in Somalia in the past and showed enough investment then, and they earmarked some specific areas where they wanted to start drilling oil. That's why the Somali government is keen now on seeking the big oil corporations, especially Western countries, to come back to Somalia as a sign that Somalia is open for business. And that is one reason as to why the federal government of Somalia signed that agreement with Shell and ExxonMobil in Amsterdam earlier this month, so that they can come back here, invest here in the country. So they are going to be among the countries, not countries rather, but corporations that are going to bid for the next round of bidding. And it's not clear whether they will receive a special privilege from the Somali government that is trying to auction oil and gas blocks to big Western oil corporations, so that Somalia can invest and tap into its hydrocarbon sector. Indeed. So 15 offshore blocks are up for auction in November, as I understand it, assuming the timeline doesn't change. But walk us through a sense of where these blocks are located geographically and what the federal government hopes to gain from this process. Well, Ramah, according to the Minister of Petroleum, I interviewed him earlier in May. He said that the hydrocarbon sector in Somalia seems quite promising, as you've also mentioned in your analysis there. The fact that the federal government of Somalia passed the petroleum bill earlier, late last month, is a major step itself in the revival of the hydrocarbon sector here in Somalia. Now, the government is not specifically mentioning the areas that it's going to tap, rather these 15 blocks. It hasn't yet mentioned specific regions, but one thing that the minister assured me is for a fact that the area in contention, that is the 100,000 square kilometers that is now a bone of contention between Kenya and Somalia, will not be touched until the International Court of Justice issues a verdict on that case. So Somalia is saying that it will look into the other regions, that is the other parts of the country that is under the federal government control, and after it gets the clearance from the International Court of Justice, that is when it's going to try to explore the 100,000 square kilometer area that is in the Indian Ocean, that is now a diplomatic dispute between Kenya and Somalia. So it's saying that it will respect the decision of the ICJ, even though it seems that Somalia is confident that ICJ will rule in its favor. So the 15 blocks will be spread all across south and central Somalia, and it will be all in areas where the federal government rather controls it, and not in areas under the militant control.
Indeed, and of course, just a quick footnote on that particular issue to our viewers. Oral arguments on that particular case between Kenya and Somalia will be starting in September. One last question for you, Abdulaziz. Somalia is also due to hold elections next year. So why hold this auction now when there's still some concerns about how to share the revenues from any oil or gas exploration?
Well, Ramah, Somalia says that the fact that it has vast oil and gas potential, it does not want to wait all along this time. The oil and gas sector revival started in 2008, and it has been a continuous process. So Somalia says it doesn't want to wait until the whole country stabilizes, but then again, it wants to show investors that the country has vast oil and gas potential, and it wants to explore these so that it can use all the resources available in its hands, so that it can make enough income, make enough revenue, create more industries, create more jobs for young people. And it's saying that they have a special working arrangement with the federal member states, and that was a bone of contention for months. And the fact that Parliament itself endorsed the petroleum bill sets the stage now for Somalia to start exploring its hydrocarbon sector, hoping that it's going to create enough money for Somalia to revive and kickstart its weak economy. Somalia largely relies on donor support, and this is one thing that it's trying to avoid. So the fact that it has oil and gas, so the Minister of Finance says that once oil drilling starts, Somalia will be in a better position to be able to fund its own budget, and not rather rely on handouts from World Bank, IMF and other big financial institutions. So it's saying that elections will take place, and also the oil and drilling will start taking place. So it says they have a special working arrangement with federal member states, and as long as that deal still exists, it hopes to create more jobs for young people, to tackle illegal migration and create revenue for the country.
Indeed. We leave it there for the time being. Abdulaziz Billo from the seaside capital of Mogadishu. Thank you. All right, then a quick summary through some other company news that we're keeping a very close eye on, starting with Airtel Africa. Its shares fell by as much as 15% on Friday after its debut on the London stock market. It hit a low of about 85 US cents against an initial IPO price of about 80 pence, $1.24. Now, it was trading at about 70.5 pence at 9:15 GMT. The company is a unit of India's Bharti Airtel Limited. It's at a price range of between 80 to 100 pence per share last week for its IPO, before pricing right at the bottom of that spread. Elsewhere, the global ride-hailing firm Uber is in talks with regulators over plans to expand into 2 West African countries and to also provide a boat service in the Nigerian mega-metropolis of Lagos. Uber says discussions are on with regulators in Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal regarding the possible launch of these services as well. Johnny Ive, a close creative collaborator with Apple co-founder Steve Jobs, whose iPhone and other designs fueled Apple's rise to become a $1 trillion company, will be leaving later this year to form an independent design company. He spent nearly 3 decades at Apple leading the design of candy-colored iMacs. It helped Apple to re-emerge from near death in the 1990s to the supremacy based on the iPhone, regarded by some experts as one of the most successful consumer products of all time. And the owner of Legoland Theme Parks aims to go private in a $6.1 billion buyout, seeking to invest more in worldwide expansion and to attract new fans of the plastic bricks in markets like China. Merlin Entertainment says that the Danish family behind the Lego empire agreed to a joint offer with the private equity firm Blackstone Group and Canadian pension fund CPPIB. The deal continues a run of blockbuster private equity transactions in Europe as cash flows into buyout funds. That's a run through your company headlines. We're about 18 minutes into the hour. Plenty more content coming up, including this. Digital lenders in Kenya form a self-regulatory body, but does it go far enough? And Tanzania unveils new regulations for foreign currency dealers. What are they? How will they affect you? That and more coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Now then, the G20 summit, day one was Friday, but it's going to roll on right through the weekend. And trade is right at the heart of all the conversations that are taking place over there, or more accurately, the trade tensions between the United States and just about everybody else. So what then should we expect when India's Prime Minister meets the US President at the G20 summit? CGTN's Shweta Bajaj joins us on the phone from New Delhi. Shweta, so policymakers in India, do they expect to find themselves in a much more aggressive trade war, perhaps similar to what's happening between China and the US?
Well, not as big as what's happening between US and China. What's happening with India in terms of the figures of trade is actually a fraction of it, but there has been enough and more impact as far as the trade war, which is the ongoing trade war between India and US, is concerned. In fact, it started last year when US had removed duties from import of steel and aluminium from India. It hurt the enterprises here. This was followed by removal of India from the generalized system of preferences, for which India was the biggest beneficiary and had benefited actually by export of lots of textiles and jewelry going from here. Once that happened, the industry here was hurt, and just about a month back, right after Prime Minister Modi came into power, there was retaliatory steps taken in which in retaliation, tariffs on import of goods from United States were increased on 28 products. This also includes almonds, it includes other products, apples, for instance, all coming from a region in which Donald Trump has a whole lot of popularity. And those are areas, agricultural areas, which were suffering back in the United States also. So after this happened, there has been an ongoing trade war between both of them. And the fact that the meeting started with a social media tweet by President Donald Trump saying that India must remove all the tariffs it has imposed, and that is absolutely necessary, really set the tone. So really no decisions taken there, both the countries standing their ground. At a briefing that was held after the meeting between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Donald Trump, it was clear that both the countries have decided to take ahead their strategic relationship despite the fact that the trade relations at this point are suffering, and there would be ongoing talks which will probably lead to some sort of a middle ground, but right now, no middle ground really.
US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, though, he met the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi yesterday, actually, on the 27th of June. Given the bellicose nature of Mr. Trump's tweets, what was Thursday's meeting like?
Well, Thursday's meeting, and I was there at the press conference that was held after the meeting between Michael Pompeo and Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. It was clear that both the countries have agreed to disagree, really. Both of them haven't decided that they would be giving in. But what happened at the meeting was that they both said that the concerns of each other were understood by the other. Now they're going to take this to their leaders, and probably both the leaders could take decision. The Indian side was very clear that the leadership in India would take decisions based on national interest. India's own domestic economy has been suffering. The growth figures have fallen. We also know that, as far as consumer products is concerned, the sales have dropped drastically in the last 6 months or so. The Indian agriculture sector has been suffering as well. There has been a slowdown there. So all in all, India itself also needs to look at a domestic economy, and that's the message we got. But the same message that we got today, which said that they both have had conversation, they have understood each other's point of view, but it seems that are not really likely to walk halfway through.
Right. One last question for you, Shweta. One of the other main complaints that we keep hearing, at least from the American side, is around data localization. Because as I understand it, in India, there's the Personal Data Protection Bill that aims to localize and keep data generated within India in the country, and that's been a huge concern, not just for American companies, but also for the e-commerce players in India as well. Why are they concerned? What's the issue there?
I mean, it's no secret anymore that the oil of future is going to be data. India wasn't really on the mark as far as data protection is concerned. A recent survey was done by Cushman and Wakefield, which said that for India, the data collection is extremely important, and there should be a massive data collection center. As soon as the new government came in, we saw a sort of movement happening on the data storage center. What we understand as of now, it's a policy still in the works. But as far as the Indian government is concerned, it's not likely to give. And there's also been some reports here in India about a bill going to the Indian Parliament very soon as far as data protection is concerned. If you look at the data protection, what does the current policy say, which is sort of a draft policy really? It says that if a company is operating here in India, there should be a first copy which should remain here in India, and it can also remain with a company which is from the United States or from any other country that sets up its base here, but India must have a copy of it. Now, as far as India is concerned, and this data will be then used for the betterment of Indians, and of course this data will also be used for investigations. Now, it's not just foreign companies or other countries that are questioning this. There's a whole lot of modification that probably will happen, because here in India also a number of people questioning that how can the government keep all this data, and what are the conditions under which that data will be used against a citizen, if it ever is. So those kind of questions are actually brewing up here in India as well. But as far as the data protection policy is concerned, the current Indian government is absolutely for it, and we will see it becoming a reality very soon. And when the Indian government goes to the Indian Parliament, it won't have a problem passing the bill really, because of course Prime Minister Modi has just come back into power about a month back with a resounding majority.
Indeed. We'll see how this plays out. Shweta Bajaj in New Delhi, thank you very much. Now, let's head over to East Africa. The Digital Lenders Association has been set up in Kenya. It's in fact been officially launched in the capital, Nairobi. Now, the association also unveiled its code of conduct. The launch opened with deliberations on how to champion responsible lending and essentially and ethical practices in business too. Now, the code represents an ongoing effort to continuously evaluate how digital lending can best serve the interest of its borrowers. Digital lenders who grant loans through mobile apps and other online platforms have contributed quite a bit to Kenya's financial ecosystem. The association brings together leading digital-first lenders who don't take deposits and other key stakeholders as well. The idea is that they will work together to set ethical and professional standards across the entire industry.
We are saying that in the period while there is no formal statutory legislated regulation, there is something we can do. It will be responsible of us to sit back and watch the malpractices and some of the undesirable behavior going on in the market without taking any action on our part. We are starting off by forming an industry body which shall go a long way in creating some level of standards within which we can benchmark all players and within which consumers can refer to when and if they want to know where to go and what standard to expect from particular players in the market.
Now we'll look back to an analysis of Kenya's digital lending market a little later. For now, though, pit stop in Tanzania. Foreign exchange business companies in the country have been given the go-ahead to apply for licenses to conduct business in the country. This comes after exchange bureaus were shut down by officials in December last year. However, the country's central bank has released new regulations on how businesses must operate within that sector. They include a much higher minimum capital requirement, among other things. Here's CGTN's Daniel Kijo with the details.
Tanzania has tightened its foreign exchange controls with new regulations on foreign exchange bureau operations. Authorities say the move is part of the fight against money laundering, illicit flows, and currency speculations. The new regulations come after the government closed down around 100 bureaus and temporarily shut down a newspaper for using unofficial data on exchange rates in December last year. The President John Pombe Magufuli said that too many bureaus have breached laws.
There's quite more disclosures that are required now in terms of operating that business, in terms of reporting, and there's much more emphasis in terms of the owners to be able to adhere, and obviously the regulator has more stronger oversight and teeth in terms of seeing and monitoring what the bureaus are doing.
However, the central bank cautioned bureaus that are under investigations to not apply for the license, and those that are not closed for investigations have been given a 3-month period to raise their capital to match the newly set minimum of $450,000. The regulations require bureau de change owners to release a detailed study into the demand for their service and the location of their business. They also need to provide identity details for people who exchange money, as well as the planned use of the foreign currency. Since the government shut down exchange bureaus, commercial banks have been running the exchange of forex in Tanzania. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania.
Back to Kenya to look at the e-commerce space now. The on-demand e-commerce and delivery platform GoBeba has set up shop in Kenya. It essentially is a service that allows Kenyans to shop through the platform from just about any shop and then have it delivered to wherever they are. Office, home, you name it. Pick the location, the goods will come to you. At the same time, though, it does lend a hand in delivering goods to micro-retailers in small urban centres right across the country. GoBeba has come up essentially with a new business model. Rather than just being a logistics platform, the service pairs on-demand logistics capabilities with a digital marketplace specifically tailor-made for the local market. So customers and businesses at the end do have access to a range of services, everything from getting your groceries to having parcels moved around to even getting food and drinks delivered to you, and all of that without the need to download multiple apps. So then, how does this all work? Let's find out. The founder and CEO of GoBeba is here with me. He's called Peter Nyang. Prior to that, he was the GM of OLX, the Naspers owned e-commerce platform. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much.
Right, so you spent quite a bit of space in the e-commerce space. I mean, OLX, having OLX on your CV was generally that big red flag, and I was like, okay, this is interesting.
Right.
Other than last mile logistics, because I'm going to get to that in a moment, what holds back e-commerce in Africa?
I think a couple of things, but I think largely has been, as many people have cited before, internet penetration was previously a challenge, is still a challenge in certain countries. I think Kenya has moved quite a bit in that angle, and also East Africa, we see it moving quite quickly to get everybody connected. But I think logistics has been these almost like a black box, and everybody says, well, the challenge is logistics. But I think as you kind of open up the box of logistics, you start seeing that actually it can be solved because solutions just do exist. Because today, a lot of various folks with motorcycles actually take part in delivering goods to people's homes. And so they don't have to know people's addresses, because people have cited address system. At this age, if you look at all the technologies happening like global positioning, it's not really essential to have such a legacy addressing system. So,
yeah, because the thing about this whole e-commerce logistics side is there's a lot of off-the-shelf, for lack of a better word, solutions, right? You and I use Google Maps all the time, right? To come here, all we had to do is send you a link.
Right.
You've got, what's 3 words, which basically has the entire world mapped out, and you can get any location, literally in 3 words. Most of us have access to smartphones, even if they're, the $300 ones or less, that will give you a GPS location. You've got motorbikes virtually on every street in Africa. So is the problem integrating all of these into a cohesive solution?
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's where GoBeba is heading. So when we identify this as a key bottleneck across sub-Saharan Africa, and you'll start seeing that Asia has been solving this problem just through local solutions of normal motorcycle forks. I think we are at a place where we can solve that logistic solution without having to keep pressuring, oh, the post office has to do X. It's a legacy institution.
I noticed something else about your business. Yeah. You avoid apps.
Yeah.
You're not a fan of apps. Why?
Well, it's been deliberate.
Yeah.
Because first of all, as a startup, we just wanted to first figure out, are people willing to use this service without overburdening them with apps to download? I mean, the real estate of a typical phone that is in the market today is actually quite small.
Right, so you're targeting even someone who's got a feature phone.
Exactly.
Right, you should be able to, because your system, if I remember the flowchart, would be you call, say what you want, we'll get it for you.
That's right.
And then we'll deliver it to wherever you are.
And so, in fact, our implementation of a logistics solution has started more not to the consumer end, but to the guy who is delivering. So we've got a dispatch solution that is GPS mapped, but mainly for the guy who is carrying your goods. And so what that means is that we are enabling folks who have feature phones to call us. We have a call center, and that's a key thing in a market where also trust levels are a little bit low. People always want to find out, hey, did I just do an order that went into the dark?
So we don't trust software. We'd much rather call someone.
Exactly. We want to actually talk to somebody and know, are these guys actually in business?
There's something else, though, since you're here. Jumia's listing raised a whole lot of questions around the capital ecosystem in which African tech startups essentially are finding themselves in. The question was, if you're listing in New York, why aren't you listing in Johannesburg, for instance? If the question is, you want to raise capital, Joburg is awash with liquidity, what's the issue there? But then the question became, well, what's the ecosystem, especially in terms of capital, in terms of tech support, that allows entrepreneurs to actually grow?
Exactly.
Is that ecosystem there? Does it exist? Is there capital available for you to essentially put this business up from the ground entirely with capital from Africa?
I think the simple answer to that is not quite. I think it's changing quite dramatically, but I think what we've seen is that investors in sub-Saharan Africa have needed to not just learn about the new ways of technology financing, but also unlearn the old ways of real estate financing applied to technology business, high growth businesses that are growing. And so there are changes that are happening. We see a lot of VCs now setting up. We see a lot of successes that are starting to come out. Those entrepreneurs are going to become the super angel investors who are also going to attract VC capital that is localized. And that is extremely important because what you don't want is foreign capital that might not have a great understanding of the local nuance.
Because there's an alignment problem.
Exactly.
Right. So, Peter, I'd love to continue this conversation, but I'm running short of time. Best of luck. That was essentially a good elevator pitch. I'll leave it there for the time being.
Thank you very much.
Peter. Yeah. Much appreciated. Right. So let's move on to Uganda. Tea producers in Africa are struggling to stay in business as global leaf prices fluctuate quite a bit. Tea prices have been pretty volatile. And local farmers in tea-producing countries like Uganda now want the government to step in. Uganda grows tea on roughly 45,000 hectares of land. At least 97% of their output is sold at the world's second biggest tea auction in the neighboring country of Kenya. CGTN's Michael Baleke filed this report.
Farmers can pick the tea, but they can't pick the price.
First of all, as a tea farmer and a tea producer, we do not determine the prices. Prices are determined on the auction market. And whatever game they play, we can't know. Because currently, I think the price fluctuation has become cyclic. Every after 5 years, we really get a serious collapse or decline in prices.
More than 500,000 people in Uganda depend on tea farming, but the growers are not earning enough to break even. They're now requesting for financial assistance from the government.
We've just seen that tea contributes so much to the economy of the country, so government needs to come up and support farmers. Like currently, we really need government push if we are to sustain the business.
The farmers also want the government to provide a revolving fund for inputs like fertilizers and herbicides to boost production and quality. The ongoing conflicts and political turmoil in some of Uganda's main tea export markets like Sudan and South Sudan are also negatively impacting sales. Exporters say the tensions are pushing buyers to place fewer orders.
We are going to see brighter days. In terms of production, I must say that Africa has been a major producer of tea, and for this matter, fairly good quality tea. We, however, must put in a lot of emphasis on ensuring that we make premium teas that can be competitive in the world markets.
Tea is Uganda's second largest agricultural export after coffee, and according to the central bank's records, the value of Uganda's tea exports has been increasing for the last 3 years. But the recent increase in production by other tea-producing countries is hurting the bottom line of the local farmer. Michael Baleke, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Now then, let's get back to Kenya, specifically its digital lending space. As you heard a few minutes ago, the sector is largely unregulated, but that doesn't mean that you don't have Kenyan adults, millions of them in fact, using these services. The loan sizes are relatively small, between $7 to $50, and at least 8.3% of Kenyan adults have borrowed either from a bank or a non-deposit taking digital lender in 2018. Now, that's according to a joint survey done by Kenya's Central Bank, the country Statistics Bureau, and FSD. But there's a massive data distortion cloud, really, around this sector. So earlier on, I spoke to Kwame Owino. He's the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs here in Kenya. A survey that firm did indicated that, at least at face value, the default rate on digital lenders was lower than that on banks. But Kwame started by explaining why that metric needs a lot closer examination.
They claim that they have some kind, everybody hides behind the fact that we have an algorithm. So they say they have an algorithm that allows them to be able to tell your ability to pay and actually your willingness to pay as well. So that's one. But my thinking as well is that those figures are probably the same. It's only that the way they report, defaults are probably not the same. It's not the same definition in them for them.
Because also for banks, they have to report under IFRS 9. So,
yes, precisely.
So if the loan is impaired within, say, 30 days, you have to report it.
You have to report that, precisely. Right. So I think that's why. So bank reports and the criteria that they apply, in my view, is probably more stringent, and that allows for that spread.
What about because the thing about this industry, it's not regulated. There's no single pool of information that we can all go to and say, okay, this is what the sector looks like. So, given the fact that it's a mix of regulated entities and non-regulated entities who don't take deposits, what's the data gap in this study? What do we not know?
Yes, I think what we don't know is first the default rates to begin with, whether we are measuring in the same way. I suspect we are not measuring it in the same way, because when banking institutions tell you about default, they are probably applying a different thing. And when these other guys tell you about defaults, they also might be applying a different thing altogether. So that's a first. And then quantum. One other thing that we don't know, because people know that I think many of these, I was at a discussion yesterday when they said that 7.5 million Kenyans actually, or 7.5 million loans have been provided by the non-conventional lenders who use apps. They're not banking institutions, but you're not sure whether that's discrete accounts or whether it's actually the same people having
because
3 or 4.
People might actually have, and I think that's one of the things that came up in the study, because what people tend to do is, I'll borrow from this guy, and then borrow from this other app to pay off this guy.
Precisely, yeah.
And
so
then it just keeps rolling on.
So you're not too sure how many people have multiple accounts or multiple liabilities with each one of them.
The central bank governor, when we spoke to him about this topic in March, when we met in Kigali, he described the lending practices in this market segment in some extent as predatory.
Yes.
I believe we went as far as describing them as Shylocks in one instance. And he's pretty much maintained that line of argument, because his argument is that if you look at the total cost of any such facility, it's pretty high. It's at least in the triple digits in terms of APR. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Well, let's go back to Shylocks. It is possible that actually, the reason I think the governor should be smiling, in my view, is that if these digital lending apps, whether bank-led or those that are provided through other services, come in, then basically what it means is that they might actually shrink out, or rather they might actually wipe out the Shylocks, which is not any formal system and all that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think having his nose again, high in the air against them is a bit unfair, in my view. So that's the first thing. The second thing is these guys are just putting their own capital. They're not taking in any deposits, at least so far. So if they're not taking any deposits, they're taking huge risks. And thirdly, asking them to compare themselves to banks, I think we are not comparing like for like. It's clear. Why? Because most of these people actually rely on very little data. They have to be very, very keen. The ability to collect and the contractual systems are also very different. But the most important thing is they're taking a huge leap of faith because the decision is made almost instantaneously. Yeah. I mean, in many cases, they make that decision very, very quickly. They also calculate how much it is. But thirdly, most of their sums are very small. So for instance, if you're lending 500 shillings to somebody who wants to use it to repair something, I mean, to repair a gadget, I don't think you should go through all those formal channels like a conventional bank will ask you to fill forms, go all the way, ask you to bring in your pay sheet, your pay slips and everything else. So their fixed costs relative to the loans that they give are very high. So when you compare those, I think we need to be a little more cautious comparing APRs on one side with these others.
But what about the data side of it? Because at the heart of all of this is the fact that these individuals are basically lending to you and they're gathering an enormous amount of information about your life, your contacts, who you're most commonly in touch with, how often are you in touch with them, who are the people in your circles of influence and that sort of thing. And in this country, we both know there's very little in the way of legal protection or determination on how that data can be used, who should hold it, for how long, and for what purpose they can hold it. So in as much as we agree, yes, they do not have to have a banking-like regulatory approach. What about the data side?
Well, I think the data side is something that's not only for the purposes of banking and digital. We need data protection laws, which covers for the fact that, yes, in the course of commerce today, people acquire a lot of information about you, and how they use that information should actually have there should be principles for how that information is used, and it should be used specifically for the purposes, declaration. So for instance, to declare to me, if I go into a building and I sign up, to declare to me that we might one day call you, or after 90 days we are going to destroy this, or to give me the assurance that we are not going to share your data. I just needed to sign in to come to this building, right? So that should be data protection irrespective of what business is, and I think some consumer protection is required around that. I think the most egregious examples are some of these unscrupulous lenders who actually start to go through your address book and call your mom and tell him, look, this guy owes us money for 2 weeks and he hasn't been
actually send messages
and send messages to your friends and everything. I don't think that's acceptable. So obviously drawing that kind of data protection and obviously consumer protection, and actually asking for consent before any of that information is used for other things, supersedes, or rather goes beyond just for the purposes of lending. It's every kind of person who collects data in their legitimate business, and they should have some boundaries about how that data can be used outside their business or who it can be shared with.
Right then, time for a short break. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. Inflation rebounds in the EU, but it offers little calm to the central bank. We'll also take a look at the latest measures by the Australian government to regulate the use of cryptocurrencies.
Thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Underlying inflation in the Eurozone rebounded in June. It offered a bit of comfort to the European Central Bank, the ECB, but it still fell short of the improvement that policymakers have been hoping for. Overall inflation held steady as expected, 1.2%, but that's well short of the ECB's target of almost 2%. A more closely watched core figure, which excludes food and energy prices, went up to 1.2% from 1% in May. But the weak inflation has puzzled policymakers for quite a while now. The 19-country currency bloc has created over 10 million jobs since the worst days of its debt crisis. And employment is the highest on record. Wages also rising relatively fast. So effectively what you have is a textbook environment for high prices, but that's not really happening yet. Staying with the EU economy, the euro did edge a little higher on Friday after the core inflation gauges in the eurozone held firm in June. On a monthly basis, the euro is set to rise nearly 2%. That's its biggest monthly gain since February last year. And that's off the back of broad-based dollar weakness. But analysts said policymakers would focus on the weak outlook for inflation with growing concern, like how much firepower the European Central Bank could potentially roll out to support a struggling economy and to boost prices. Now, concerning inflation, strategists over at ING said headline inflation will continue to face downward pressure in the months to come, as businesses have indicated softening expectations for selling prices on the back of economic uncertainty. Markets also hoping that a meeting between the US President Donald Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping at the G20 meeting will bring a bit of progress on trade. Now, among the numerous tech issues that countries are facing, especially those in the G20, how best to regulate the increasing use of digital currencies is a key one. In Australia, the government has taken steps to ensure that users of cryptocurrencies pay their share of taxes while staying within the law. CGTN's Greg Navarro filed this report from Sydney.
It's a new high of $9,090.
When Fred Sebesta looks at the value of digital currencies, the co-founder of global brokerage Hivex sees enormous potential.
It's not going anywhere. This is just about to get bigger and bigger.
The Australian government is also looking at the increasing use of cryptocurrencies. It estimates that up to 1 million Australians have invested in crypto assets. Australia is among a global effort to try and regulate their use.
They don't want to completely ban cryptocurrency. They think that there is some innovation in there. They don't want to completely remove that sector.
The Australian Tax Office is in the process of ensuring that users adhere to tax guidelines. The ATO is also concerned with the illegal use of cryptocurrencies to do things such as move funds within the black economy and hide money offshore.
That's the main fear. It's crime and also the use for terrorism in Australia.
It also says it's working with a global tax enforcement effort involving several countries aimed at investigating cryptocurrency-related tax evasion and money laundering.
All currencies have a degree of black market transactions. Cash is probably the number one system today where money is laundered, and there has been several banking institutions of recent that have been, I guess, that this has been a major concern for them.
Fred Sebesta welcomes the push to better regulate the use of digital currencies.
It brings about more legitimacy, it makes it more transparent, and it makes this use case even better and better over time.
He also sees the increasing effort to regulate cryptocurrencies as an acknowledgement of their value, not just financially, but as a technology and method of transaction that will continue to grow. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
Right, then a quick run through commodity prices here for you. Bit of an update on the number we have up for crude oil. Brent has actually dropped about $2 a barrel to around the 64-ish, 64.5, 64.6 level in the last half hour or so. Not quite sure exactly what triggered that. Copper prices have been relatively flat for most of the year, only about 0.4% higher at today's prices in London. But that said, Africa's second largest copper producer, Zambia, isn't doing well. Its economy grew by a very paltry 2.6% in the first quarter. 2.5%, remember, was the print for the fourth quarter of 2018. Vedanta Resources, one of the big miners over there, didn't get a court order, though, blocking the state-appointed liquidator from selling off the assets. Bookmarked the 4th of July for a hearing on that particular matter. Now then, the African continent is working on integrating a regional trade bloc pretty much across the entire continent, or at least a big fraction of it. Member states have intensified preparations to implement an agreement which is expected to boost trade within the continent. But Zimbabwe says it's not ready to fully implement the African Continental Free Trade Area Pact until it has industrialized. Here's CGTN's Mahia Mutua explaining.
Africa hasn't been left behind in moving towards trade integration to expand its market. By March this year, 52 out of 55 states of the African Union signed a continental free trade agreement. However, according to the government of Zimbabwe, the nation expects to fully implement the trade pact in about 15 years when it has fully industrialized. Zimbabwe is currently in the midst of an economic crisis after years of sanctions.
We are also aware that, there will be some challenges in terms of adjustment. We have put in a reservation in terms of the time period of implementation the modalities of this agreement. Zimbabwe believes that the opportunities that the Continental Free Trade Area offers to us as Zimbabwe and offers to the continent are so immense that they outweigh whatever disadvantages that we may, experience.
Many African countries are at the moment in various stages of development, modernization, and industrialization. Intra-African trade accounts for only about 16% of trade with the rest of the world. This has brought fears amongst key stakeholders in Zimbabwe's manufacturing sector. They claim that trade with big companies in the free trade area will affect its export competitiveness. But the African Union Commission says African businesses should take the lead in exploiting trade and economic opportunities in the continental free trade area.
If we look at our challenges as a continent, no country will be ready. We should not look at our challenges. We should look at our opportunities and where we want to go. All the obstacles that we see, all the challenges that we see, we will overcome them. And Zimbabwe stands an excellent opportunity to really benefit from this.
The African Free Trade Agreement is expected to create a tariff-free continent of 1.2 billion people worth about $2.5 trillion US. Its operational launching phase is scheduled to take place on July the 7th at this year's African Union Summit in Niamey, Niger.
Now, an experimental artist, Dise Tantua, is creating some pretty unconventional furniture using car parts from the 90s. The 44-year-old Ghanaian Nigerian says he hopes his pieces will help preserve the history and memories that he believes are contained in much-loved vehicles. Here's CGTN's Alexandria Majala with that story.
This art studio in Port Harcourt, Nigeria could easily be mistaken for a car showroom. But a closer look reveals that it is filled with pieces of artistic furniture that give old car body parts a new lease of life.
Someone had created a table, an office desk with it, so I felt it would be a good idea using the flatboat, which because it has a flat back, to create this space. To recreate my office, I used my father's car. And ever since, everybody is in love with it, and so it pushed me into using the other parts of the car to make other things. And that's how I started.
The cars being repurposed here are mostly classic models like the Mercedes-Benz Volkswagen Beetle that were popular in Nigeria in the 1990s. The vehicles were sought for their resilience and many people have fond memories attached to them. However, with the advent of automatic cars, most families are finding it difficult to maintain these classic manual vehicles.
Aside from having a piece of art that is beautiful, is useful, it's a relic, I mean, we all know, from the past that Mercedes-Benz in this country is something that Nigerians cherish, and it's something that my father drove, you understand? So there's history there.
Tantua started marketing his creations in 2016 after receiving a lot of positive feedback on the table he made out of his father's car. He began getting orders from family and friends who were also finding it difficult to maintain old family cars. The 44-year-old sculpts bed frames, chairs, bookshelves and wine bars from the vehicles. In 2017, Tantua hosted a solo exhibition at a car showroom, hoping to spark conversations around upcycling and other ways of turning junk into art.
They are not what you can find any and everywhere. They are special cars which are celebrated, used and celebrated. Sometimes I leave them in their bad shape and try to make sure that there's less rust on it again. I make sure that for every piece of mine you find, you want to go back to it, either take a photograph or you want to be a part of it in some way.
Tantua gets his car parts from junkyards and car owners. The applied arts graduate also buys grounded cars. His furniture costs between $1,400 to $7,000 US, depending on the complexity of the piece and car parts used. Tantua has sold several pieces to homes, offices and top galleries across the country. He also expresses his creativity through other mediums like drawing and painting. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
on the business of upcycling furniture. That's where we're going to leave this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last 60 minutes. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.